1,900,000,000 people, almost a quarter of the world's population, all following a faith that was born from a single night of desperation in the desert of Canaan. And the most disturbing part, the Bible described this movement 4,000 years before Muhammad was born, verse by verse, characteristic by characteristic. This is the prophecy about Ishmael that no one knows. To understand what is about to be revealed, you need to go back to a tent in the desert, around 1900 years before Christ. Abraham was 75 years old when God made a promise that would change the history of humanity. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, records the exact words, "From Abraham would come a great nation, and through him all the families of the earth would be blessed." The problem was biological and apparently insurmountable. Sarah, his wife, was barren. Years passed, 5 years, 10 years. Sarah remained childless, and Abraham kept aging. With each passing season, with each new moon rising over the desert, the promise seemed more distant. At 85 years old, with Sarah already in menopause, biological mathematics had defeated theology. It was then that Sarah made a decision that would reverberate for 4 millennia. Genesis chapter 16 begins with a brutal and direct confession. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. Barrenness in the ancient Middle East was not just a medical condition, it was social shame. It was existential failure. It was visible curse. A woman without children was an incomplete woman in the eyes of the culture. And Sarah carried this shame for decades. The solution she proposed was common in Mesopotamia at that time, recorded in legal codes like Hammurabi's, but it carried consequences that no one could foresee. Hagar was Egyptian, a slave, property. Sarah offered her to her own husband as a kind of surrogate mother of antiquity. Mesopotamian custom allowed a barren wife to offer her servant to her husband, and the child born would be legally considered the wife's child. Abraham agreed, and that night, in the silence of the Canaan desert, the seed of a division was planted that to this day defines borders, wars, and peace treaties. But what happened after Ishmael's birth reveals something that most have never heard. Hagar became pregnant quickly, and the moment she perceived life growing inside her, something changed in her. Demeanor. Genesis 16 verse 4 uses a precise Hebrew expression. She began to look at Sarah with contempt. The slave carrying the heir began to despise the barren mistress. The power dynamic instantly inverted. Whoever had the fertile womb now had the real power, regardless of social status. The biblical text does not romanticize this story. It does not hide the shadows. Sarah felt the blow, and she reacted with brutality proportional to the humiliation she felt. Genesis 16 verse 6 says that Sarah afflicted Hagar. The Hebrew word used is anna. And here is a detail that completely changes the perspective. It is the same word used in Exodus to describe the oppression of the Egyptians over the Israelites. The same verbal root that defines brutal slavery, forced labor, systematic dehumanization. Sarah did not merely rebuke Hagar. She humiliated, mistreated, oppressed. The irony is cutting, an Egyptian being treated by a Hebrew exactly as the Egyptians would treat the Hebrews centuries later. And Hagar did the only thing a pregnant and desperate slave could do. She fled, pregnant, alone, in the desert, without water, without food, without direction, without hope. It was there, by a spring of water on the way to Shur, that something extraordinary happened that few preachers mention. The angel of the Lord found Hagar, and here is the first revelation that changes everything. This is the first appearance of the angel of the Lord recorded in Scripture. It was not for Abraham, the patriarch of faith. It was not for Sarah, the promised matriarch. It was for an Egyptian slave, a fugitive, pregnant, abandoned in the desert, without any apparent merit. Many theologians identify the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament as a theophany, an appearance of Christ himself before his incarnation. If this interpretation is correct, the first time God manifested himself in this way in biblical history was for the most despised woman in the entire Genesis narrative. How is this possible? What he said to Hagar in that desert contains the most detailed prophecy ever made about an individual in the book of Genesis. No other character received such a specific description of their future and the future of their descendants before even being born. Genesis chapter 16, verses 11 and 12 records the exact words, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." 4 prophetic characteristics in just 2 verses. Each one has been fulfilled with astonishing precision over 4 millennia. And it continues to be fulfilled as you read these words. But before examining the fulfillment, you need to understand the weight of each element. The name Ishmael in Hebrew is Yishmael. It literally means God hears, not God heard in the past as a concluded event. God hears in the continuous present as a permanent reality. The boy's name would be a perpetual memorial that God listens to the cry of the afflicted, even when that cry comes from a pagan slave fleeing mistreatment. Even when there is no visible merit, even when conventional theology would say that this person does not deserve divine attention. God hears. And here is something that few notice and even fewer preach. Ishmael is the first biblical character whose name was given directly by God before birth. Not even Isaac received this privilege in this way. The slave's son was named by the Creator himself before seeing the light of day, but it is the second part of the prophecy that causes theological discomfort. He shall be a wild donkey of a man. The Hebrew expression is per Adam. The wild donkey of the desert, also called the onager, was known in antiquity for very specific characteristics that any desert dweller would immediately recognize. First, absolutely untamable. Job chapter 39, verses 5 through 8, describes this animal with revealing details that illuminate the prophecy about Ishmael. Who set him free? Who gave him the desert as his home and the salt land as his dwelling? He laughs at the tumult of the city. He does not hear the shouts of the driver. He ranges the mountains as his pasture and searches for every green thing. The wild donkey could not be domesticated by any known technique. It would not accept masters, no matter how skilled they were. It would not submit to a yoke, no matter how hard they tried. The prophecy was saying that Ishmael's descendants would be a people who would fiercely resist any external domination. And how was this fulfilled in documented history? The Ishmaelite Arabs were never completely conquered by any empire of antiquity. The Assyrians dominated the Middle East with legendary brutality, but the desert tribes remained free in the sands of Arabia. The Babylonians expanded their borders to Egypt, but the desert of the Arabian Peninsula resisted. The Persians built the largest empire the world had ever seen until then, extending from India to Egypt, encompassing 127 provinces. But the interior of the Arabian Peninsula was never Persian. Alexander the Great conquered everything in his path, from the Mediterranean to the ends of India, at a speed that still impresses military historians. He planned to conquer Arabia in his next campaign. He died in 323 BC before he could. The Romans annexed provinces in all directions. They built roads, aqueducts, and cities everywhere. They dominated Judea, Syria, Egypt, but Rome never dominated the heart of Arabia. Even when they managed to control the coastal edges, the interior remained wild, free, untamable, exactly as the prophecy had declared. And then came the turnaround that no one could have predicted. In the 7th century AD, Ishmael's descendants did not merely resist empires, they built one. In less than 100 years after Muhammad's death, the Islamic Caliphate stretched from Spain to India. The people who had been prophesied as a wild donkey went from passive resistance to active conquest. The empire that the Romans could not build in Arabia, the Arabs built on the ruins of Rome. The prophecy of Genesis 16 did not only predict resistance, it predicted temperament, the untamable spirit, the absolute refusal to submit, and when they finally moved, they moved the world. But the most controversial part of the prophecy has not yet been examined. His hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. This verse is frequently quoted superficially by commentators as if it were only about military conflict or a tendency toward violence. But the Hebrew text is deeper and more disturbing. The expression hand against in biblical Hebrew indicates fundamental opposition, structural resistance, conflict of interests that cannot be resolved through negotiation. The prophecy does not say that Ishmael would be evil or morally inferior. It says that he would be in constant and unresolvable tension with the world around him, and this tension would be reciprocal and permanent. He against everyone, everyone against him. Look at the geopolitical map of the last 100 years. How many conflicts directly or indirectly involve Muslim-majority nations? How many borders have been disputed for decades without resolution? How many peace treaties have been signed with hope and broken with blood? The prophecy did not create the conflict. It predicted it 4,000 years in advance, and it continues to be fulfilled in every headline about the Middle East. And there is still the fourth characteristic that closes the prophetic cycle. He shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. The Hebrew expression al-Pene can mean before, to the east of, or in defiance of. All translations point to the same reality. Ishmael's descendants would dwell in constant presence among the other Semitic peoples. They would not be exterminated like so many ancient peoples were. They would not be absorbed and disappear like the Hittites or the Philistines. They would not dissipate in history like morning mist. They would remain visible, present, impossible to ignore. 4,000 years later, a quarter of humanity spiritually descends from that promise made to a fugitive slave in the desert. The prophecy was fulfilled, and it continues to be fulfilled. But what happened between Hagar and Sarah after that divine encounter reveals layers that few preachers explore in their sermons. God told Hagar to return. Genesis 16 verse 9 is direct and seems cruel at first reading. Return to your mistress and submit to her. Return to the one who mistreated her. Submit again to oppression. Bow before the one who humiliated her. It seems unfair. It seems inhumane. But there was a promise along with the command that changed the entire calculation. Verse 10, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. The same language used for Abraham. Countless descendants, incalculable multitude. Hagar, an Egyptian fugitive slave, received a patriarchal promise. She returned. Ishmael was born. Abraham was 86 years old. For 13 complete years, Ishmael was the only son, the undisputed heir, the visible fulfillment of God's promise. Abraham loved him with all the intensity of a father who had waited decades for a son. Genesis 17 verse 18 records the patriarch's cry when God announced that Sarah would have another son. Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. When God revealed that Sarah at 90 years old would bear a son, Abraham's first reaction was not joy at the fulfilled promise. It was concern for Ishmael. He already had a son. He had already loved this son for 13 years. The idea of another heir meant complication, not blessing. But God was absolutely clear. The covenant would be established with Isaac, the son who would yet be born to Sarah, and Ishmael. What would happen to the beloved firstborn? God's response about Ishmael contains the second great prophecy that would define the destiny of billions. Genesis 17, verses 20 and 21. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation, but I will establish my covenant with Isaac. Two distinct promises for two different sons, two lineages with separate destinies. Isaac would carry the formal covenant, the messianic line, the pact that would lead to Christ. Ishmael would carry abundant blessing, extraordinary multiplication, undeniable national greatness, but not the covenant. Here is the root of the division that would last 4 millennia and continues to define world geopolitics. 13 years later, when Ishmael was approximately 16 or 17 years old, came the final rupture that would separate the lineages forever. Isaac was born. Sarah finally had her own son at 90 years of age. And on the day Isaac was weaned, probably at 3 years of age according to the custom of the time, Abraham threw a great feast to celebrate. It was during this celebration that Sarah saw something that awakened immediate and uncontrollable fury. Genesis 21 verse 9 says, she saw Hagar's son laughing or mocking. The Hebrew word is metzachek. It is an intensive form of the verb zachak, which means to laugh. It is the same verb that gives rise to the name Isaac, Yitzhak, which means he laughs or laughter. Ishmael was Isaaking, mocking the laughter, ridiculing the name, imitating with scorn. Sarah exploded with the fury of a mother protecting her young. Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. The demand was brutal and final, not just temporarily distance, permanently expel. And Abraham, Genesis 21 verse 11 says, the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son, not on account of Hagar, on account of Ishmael. That was his firstborn, his son for 17 years, the boy he had circumcised along with himself when God established the sign of the covenant, the teenager he had taught to ride, to hunt, to survive in the desert. Abraham loved Ishmael with a father's love, but God confirmed Sarah's sentence. Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. The covenant lineage would pass exclusively through Isaac. There was no possible negotiation, but God added a promise about Ishmael that softened the blow. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. Ishmael would not be abandoned to death. He would be abundantly blessed, but separated. The division was necessary so that the two lineages could follow their distinct destinies without contamination. What happened the next morning is one of the most painful scenes in all of Scripture. Genesis 21, verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. Early in the morning, before the house was fully awake, before there were witnesses to the moment of separation, bread and a skin of water, to cross the desert with a growing teenager. Abraham, the man who had countless flocks, hundreds of servants, silver and gold in abundance accumulated over decades, sent away his own son with a piece of bread and a water container. Why so little? Why this apparent cruelty from a loving father? Some scholars suggest that Abraham could not give more without openly defying Sarah and creating a greater conflict. Others believe he trusted that God would take care of them as he had promised. Still others argue that the economy of the biblical narrative simply does not mention everything that was given. But the text is clear. in what it chooses to describe: bread, water, desert. And Hagar wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba without direction, the same desert where she had encountered the angel of the Lord years before when she fled while pregnant. But this time there was no spring of water along the way. This time the provision would run out, the water ran out. Genesis 21, verse 15 describes the moment with brutal rawness. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. The Hebrew verb translated as put is shalak. It is a violent verb: to throw, to hurl, to discard. Hagar did not gently place her son in the shade with maternal care. She threw him. Dehydration was already affecting her judgment and her strength. Physical exhaustion had taken over her limbs. Hope had died in her heart. She could no longer carry the teenager's weight. She could no longer pretend there was a solution. What she did next reveals the complete abyss of her despair. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." A bow shot away, approximately 100 meters, far enough not to see the details of death, close enough to still be present. She sat on the hot sand and waited for her son to die of thirst. There was nothing more to do, no plan, no hope, no prayer that she knew. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. The text is specific. It was not the boy who cried first. It was Hagar, the mother watching the slow death of her son, lifted up her voice and wept in the empty desert. But the next verse adds something crucial. And God heard the voice of the boy. Ishmael was also crying under that bush. And here is the devastating irony that spans millennia. The boy's name meant God hears, Ishmael. And at the exact moment when death seemed absolutely inevitable, when there was no natural reason for hope, God heard, not the mother's cry, the boy's cry, the cry of the one whose name was a prophecy in itself. The angel of God called from heaven, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." And then God did something that changes the entire perspective on divine provision. Genesis 21, verse 19. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The well was already there. The water already existed. It had probably been there the whole time, but Hagar could not see. Despair had blinded her perception. The certainty of death had blocked her ability to see the life around her. God did not create the well at that moment with a spectacular miracle. He opened her eyes to see what already existed and she had not perceived. How many times is provision right in front of us and we cannot see it because the pain is too great? Hagar filled the skin. She gave the boy water to drink, and the biblical text summarizes the rest of Ishmael's life in a few verses that cover decades. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. God was with the boy, despite the expulsion from Abraham's house, despite the separation from the formal covenant, despite not being the son of the messianic promise. God was with Ishmael. He grew strong in the hostile desert. He became a skilled archer. He lived in Paran, a region that corresponds approximately to the northern Arabian Peninsula, and he married an Egyptian, definitively connecting his lineage to both lands. Canaan through his father Abraham, Egypt through his mother Hagar and his wife. The prophecy of the 12 princes was fulfilled exactly as promised. Genesis 25, verses 13 through 16 lists Ishmael's 12 sons: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. 12 princes, 12 tribes, exactly as God had promised Abraham in Genesis 17, and verse 18 adds final confirmation. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. The prophecy of Genesis 16 was being fulfilled literally. Over against all his kinsmen, present, visible, permanent, impossible to ignore. But how does a 4,000-year-old biblical lineage connect with the birth of Islam in the 7th century? Islamic tradition claims that Muhammad descended from Ishmael through his son, Hagar. The Kedarites were one of the most powerful and documented Arab tribes of antiquity. Isaiah chapter 21 verse 16 mentions all the glory of Kedar in the context of prophetic judgment. Ezekiel chapter 27 verse 21 speaks of the princes of Kedar trading lambs and rams with Tyre. Jeremiah chapter 49 verse 28 records Nebuchadnezzar attacking Kedar. The tribe was real, documented, powerful, and according to traditional Arab genealogy preserved for centuries, it was from Kedar that came the lineage that would eventually reach the tribe of the Quraysh in Mecca, Muhammad's tribe. Now consider the complete implications of this connection. When Muhammad began preaching in Mecca at the beginning of the 7th century, he explicitly claimed to be a descendant of Abraham through Ishmael. The Quran, Surah 2, verses 125 through 127, describes Abraham and Ishmael building together the Kaaba, the central sanctuary of Islam in Mecca. Islamic tradition does not reject the biblical narrative of Ishmael. It radically reinterprets it. For Muslims, Ishmael was not the rejected or secondary son. He was the firstborn and chosen son. Abraham's test on Mount Moriah, according to Islamic interpretation, involved Ishmael, not Isaac. The same fundamental story. Protagonists inverted, opposite conclusions. And here is the providential irony that spans 4 millennia of human history. Sarah wanted to eliminate the competition from a slave who despised her. Hagar just wanted to survive with her son in the hostile desert. Abraham wanted domestic peace between 2 women who hated each other. None of the 3 had the slightest idea what they were setting in motion that morning of farewell. The decision of one night of impatience when Sarah offered Hagar to Abraham because she could not wait for God's promise created a division that today affects almost half the world's population daily. Jews, Christians, and Muslims. 3 monotheistic religions, 1 common patriarch, and a rivalry that began with 2 women fighting over the same man in a tent in the Canaan desert 4,000 years ago. It still defines national borders. It still provokes wars. It still complicates peace treaties. But the prophecy about Ishmael is not just about the birth of a religion or about Middle Eastern geopolitics. It is about the eternal price of human solutions to divine promises. Abraham had a clear promise from God. A son would come from Sarah. A nation would be born from that son. Blessing would flow to all families of the earth through that offspring. But the promise took time, 10 years, 20 years. Sarah visibly aged. Menopause arrived biologically. The mathematics of the body seemed to have defeated God's word. And then came the human solution to the apparent divine failure. If God is not acting in the expected time, let us help him. If the promise is not being visibly fulfilled, let us accelerate it with our wisdom. If Sarah cannot bear children biologically, let Hagar bear in her place. Ishmael was the son of human impatience. It was not technically sin. Mesopotamian custom allowed it. Abraham did not violate any known law. Sarah did not transgress any commandment revealed until then. Everything seemed reasonable, practical, even wise, but they also did not wait for God's timing. And the result of that decision made 4,000 years ago continues to reverberate in every headline about the Middle East that you read, in every failed peace negotiation that you follow, in every disputed border that you see on the map, in every attack and in every retaliation that you watch on the news, Ishmael did not disappear as Sarah hoped. His descendants multiplied like the stars of heaven, as God promised. And the prophesied tension, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, is fulfilled daily before your eyes. The question that spans the centuries is uncomfortable and brutally personal. How many times have you tried to help God fulfill what he promised? How many times did the delay seem unbearable and you decided to act on your own to speed up the process? How many Ishmaels have you created in recent decades because you could not wait for the right time? The career you forced because the promised promotion was not coming on your schedule. The relationship you rushed because loneliness hurt too much to wait. The financial decision you made because provision was taking longer than your comfort allowed. The door you broke down because God was not opening it at the desired speed. None of these things is necessarily visible sin, just as Hagar and Abraham did not technically sin against any written law. But the consequences of human solutions to divine promises rarely end when we imagine. They rarely limit themselves to what we planned. They rarely affect only those we intended. Ishmael lived 137 years, according to Genesis 25. He was buried by his sons with honor, and his descendants multiplied until they covered a quarter of today's humanity. The prophecy of Genesis 16 was fulfilled in every specific detail. The wild donkey that does not submit to external empires, the hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him in perpetual tension, the visible permanence before his brothers for millennia. 4,000 years later, every time you hear the Adhan, the Islamic call to prayer, echoing from a minaret in any city in the world, from Jakarta to London, from Cairo to Sao Paulo, you are hearing the distant echo of a promise made to a fugitive Egyptian slave crying in the desert. God hears, Ishmael, and what he heard that day still resonates in 1,900,000,000 voices. The question is not whether the prophecy was fulfilled, it was visibly fulfilled. The question is what you are generating while you wait for God's promises in your life. What Ishmaels are being born from your impatience at this exact moment? What 4,000-year consequences are you planting today without realizing it? The story of Ishmael is not just about the distant past of patriarchs and slaves. It is a mirror placed before your face. And when you look at it honestly, perhaps you will recognize your own reflection making decisions that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. Practical, logical, even wise according to available human wisdom. Abraham also thought he was being wise when he accepted Sarah's offer, and 4,000 years later, the headlines still tell the story that began that night.